Hello and welcome to the channel. So the other day I was wondering to myself, what would happen if Mario got fed up with rescuing the same princess over and over again? When he just can't take it anymore. The constant saving over and over and over. Well, that's what we're gonna make today. I'm gonna create Mario literally punching his way to freedom. We'll begin with his little gray prison first, starting off with a piece of cardboard. I will then cut along the conveniently drawn lines that I drew off camera. Once my pieces are cut out, I will then assemble those pieces by adding a long line of hot glue on the side panel. Then I will repeat that process until I have a good base shape for our game cartridge. I then add the front and top panels, followed by a little cutout on the front of the game. I got this shape by tracing the handle of my X-Acto knife. I cut out the top layer of cardboard, then carefully peel the outer skin away. I'll take the end of my X-Acto knife, push it down into the slot and smooth out the bumpy innards. I'll then go back and take that old skin flap and place it back into the slot and give it that same smooth down. Now I need to fill in all those gaps on the outside of the game cartridge. For this I used a thing called Fast and Final. It works very well and it dries very fast, which is perfect for someone like me who has no patience. Once he was dry enough, I sanded down the entire surface. And then it was time to add the lines around the sides. I got this look by using a much thinner piece of cardboard that I cut into equal strips, then I placed, glued, and wrapped around the entire game cartridge. I painted the game cartridge with a base coat that consisted of black paint and Mod Podge. Once the paint was slightly tacky, I used the tip of my finger to tap the surface to give it that textured look that the old Super Nintendo cartridges used to have. Once I completely covered it and let it dry, I drew a rough guide of where I was going to have Mario busting out of it. I start to pack some aluminum foil into the bottom of the cartridge. This gives it a little bit of weight and also something for me to stick my Mario into. I then use that gap filler to help hide and smooth out my janky cut, followed by that same black paint to finish it off. With the vast majority of the game cartridge done, I could put it aside and start working on our friendly neighborhood Italian plumber. I start off with rolling out a ball of clay that I then smooth out before adding smaller balls of clay to make the chin and cheeks. Once I get a good shape that kind of resembles a pear, I set it aside and start on the nose. I roll out a ball of clay, then I pinch and pull it until it gets kind of a teardrop shape before cramming it onto the front of the face. Up next, we're going to start on the mouth. I take my sculpting tool that is a half circle, and when I push it in at an angle, it actually gives a pretty good mouth shape. Next, we'll start on Mario's most defining feature, his bushy stache. I will cut out a flat piece of clay that I will then cut little notches out of before rounding off those notches. Then we'll take the flat ends and make those points. I'll then cut a little groove at the top that I'll then use to slide under his big old schnoz. After applying Mario's schnoz sweeper, it's time to add his lower lip. I take a small piece of tapeworm and then I smooth out all the edges. Next we're going to start on his eyebrows. I take another piece of tapeworm, which I then flatten out. And I'll use my flat sculpting tool to kind of give him some eyebrow details. And it was at this point that I realized I had made his head way too small. It will not look right at this scale. So I decided to build one off camera. Stopping pretty much where we left off, I added a little bit more detail into the mouth, gave him a tongue. Plus side about making it a little bit bigger is I could add more detail, so that's a plus. And it didn't feel like I was wasting another 6 hours of my life, but here we go. Before moving on, I saved my game by baking his head before adding his ears. To create his ears, I start with a round wheel of clay that I then cut in half. I round off the top and the bottom of those half circles, and I sculpt away to get the inside of the ear. I then mash that fresh set of cauliflower ears into the side of his face before smoothing it out. Next we start with the sideburns, pinching off a loaf of clay in which I then begin to smash into the side of his face and sculpt and mold until I get the shape of, well, his sideburns. I then take my small ball stylus and slide it across his sideburns to give it some hair texture. Up next we're going to work on his backseat cheddar. I start off with a fat log of clay, which I push into the back of his head, followed by another fat log to help bulk up the back of his head. I then take my X-Acto knife, cutting away chunks to make his signature flow. I then take my small ball stylus and continue to carry on that texture from his sideburns to the back of his head. I go ahead and bake him one more time to save my spot before going on to our next level, his hat. I take a fat wad of clay that I then begin to mash into his head. I smooth pinch and pull that fat wad till I'm happy with the shape. For the brim of the hat, I take a flat piece of clay that I then cut a half circle out of, which I then apply to the bottom of the hat, smoothing it out. I then take the hat, mash it back onto the head, and give the whole thing a rub down. Up next, we're going to start on the M that's on the front of his hat. I start off by carving in a circle and then meticulously drawing in an M. I then use my soft sculpting tool to then push around the circle to give it an embossed look. I then take the grippy part of my X-Acto knife and I roll that along the surface to give the hat a little bit of texture. For some small details, I drew a line around the hat and then I added some small dots above and below that line to indicate stitching. And with the hat finished, we could put it in the oven for one more bake and then we could start on the body. For the body, we start off with a ball of aluminum foil, then we cover that ball with a flat piece of clay. I then put smaller balls of clay on each side of the body to help bulk out the shoulders, and then I smooth it all together. Up next, we're going to start on the arms. I start off by rolling out a log of clay, then cutting it to an appropriate arm length. Then I use that same arm to help measure out the second arm before applying that to the body and bending it into position. I add a small nug of clay to the front of his body to indicate his knee. At this point, I realized his arms were a little too floppy, so I went ahead and shoved a piece of armature wire down the center. This is going to give it a little bit more structure and also gives me something to stick the hands into later. Mario was looking a little too slender, so I went ahead and bulked out his midsection with a piece of clay. Now it's time for his overalls. I start off by taking his little leg nub off, then I cut out an appropriate bib-shaped piece of clay and then place that onto his body. I went ahead and popped his head back on really quick just to make sure that the bib was centered, and also I left behind the armature wire that was in the head to help me line up the straps later. I start off by cutting out a long flat piece of clay, which I then apply to his shoulders and then cut the ends off, making points. I'm pretty happy with how the overalls are looking so far, so I think it's a good time for me to permanently apply his nub. To finish off his overalls, I go ahead and add the little buttons on the straps and then go around the entire thing, giving it the same type of texture that the hat got. With his overalls completed, I could then slide his big Italian melon back on. Before putting him in the oven, I gave him a quick size check and then I realized that there was a tiny gap underneath him. I fixed this by pushing a piece of clay into that hole, and then I took that piece, put it on the bottom of him, smoothed it out, and gave it a gradual incline. And with that, he's off to the oven for another bake. While Mario is getting baked, I go ahead and start on his hands. We start with rolling out a ball of clay, then I take that ball and mush it into a square shape before using my sculpting tool to draw out fingers. I work my way around his hand, shaping and molding his fingers until they, look like fingers. For his thumb, I pinch off a loaf of clay, then I apply that to the side of his hand and then smooth that log out. I add a long piece of tapeworm that wraps around the bottom of the glove. Then after applying the hand to Mario's arm, I finish up the glove by adding 3 dots to the back of the hand. And with that, we could put him in the oven for his final bake. Now that this Italian sausage is perfectly baked to a crispy perfection, I can place him in the game cartridge to assess where I'm going to put the broken game cartridge shards. I got these pieces by rolling out a piece of clay, then I cut them into random shapes. This section took a lot longer than expected, so I didn't film it, but here's what the final result looks like. And with that finished, we can move along to the painting section. We start the painting process off by giving the game cartridge that classic gray color. I made this color by mixing black, white, and a little bit of yellow to give it that warmer undertone. And now we go on to painting the details. I start off by painting the label, which is a big black square. Then I go around adding the little logos around the edges. I didn't actually write out what the things say, I just gave it the impression of detail by adding little dots. I thought it'd be really cool if I added the label to the back of the game shards to give it a little bit more realism, so I went around painting the Super Mario label on different pieces. And with that, our game cartridge is finished. But don't think I forgot to paint in that blowhole. For Mario, we start off with this red shirt, followed by his red hat. The red paint was actually pretty thick, so I was able to cover the whole thing in one coat. Then we're on to the blue overalls. This paint was a little thinner, so I had to do a couple more layers. Then up next, his gold buttons. Up next, we're going to paint all the white sections, being the patch on the front of his hat and his gloves. I waited off on painting the M red because I knew it was going to take a few coats to cover all the white sections. And with the white done and dry, I was able to then go in and paint the M. Up next, we're going to go ahead and paint Mario's face. I used a flesh colored paint for this. The only downside is this paint is extremely translucent, so it takes a lot of layers to get a good coverage, but once you do, it gives a really good flesh look. I painted the inside of his mouth with a darker red, followed by a lighter pink, which I tickled the tip of his tongue and added a little bit to his lips. I then finished off his mouth with those pearly white veneers. Up next, we paint his bushy black stash black and his brown hair brown. Hey, a little fun fact here for you. Did you know that the reason why his mustache and hair is a different color is because they made it that way? You're welcome. Next, we go into those baby blue eyes, starting off with that light baby blue, followed by a darker baby blue, which I then wet blend down to give it a gradient, followed by a black pupil and a little white dot. With Mario's base layers complete, we can move on, bringing him to life. We start off by giving his cheeks and nose a red wash. I let it dry a few seconds and I dab it off, giving it just a hint of red. I then go over his entire body with a lighter dry brushing of the darker undertone. And with the painting complete, it's time for those glorious glamour shots. Well, there you have it, folks. Mario breaking out of his 9-to-5 of saving a damsel and stomping Goombas. If you enjoyed me turning your childhood nostalgia into a questionable life choice, be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you could be like Yoshi and tongue punch that like button, it'll help the channel out and I'll really appreciate it. Leave a comment down below of what you'd like to see next, and I'll see you next time.